Let's put all the external evidence and internal evidence together and think through how we look at a particular textual problem. We're going to give as an example Revelation chapter 1, verse 4. In Revelation 1:4, we see that it says, "John to the 7 churches in Asia, grace to you and peace from the one who is and who was and who is to come." Now, the wording "from the one who is" unusual. And in one modern translation, the Net Bible, they say from, quote, "he who is." They put this in quotes to show that that's what John is doing in the original text. And what we've got here is simply this. After the preposition from, in English as well as in Greek, you cannot use something like the word he. That's not correct grammar. It was not correct grammar in ancient Greek. It's not correct grammar in modern English. After from, if you're going to refer to the personal pronoun, you need to say from him. From him who was would be fine, but not from he who was, or from the one who was is fine. Now what we discover is that instead of from he, they have from him. So the majority of manuscripts and the majority of late manuscripts change the wording to from he to from him. That is correct grammatically. And you can see why scribes would naturally want to change it to from him if they understand that that's the correct grammar. One scholar said that here in the book of Revelation, to say from he said, unless this was intentional, it would be considered one of the worst grammatical blunders in all of ancient Greek literature. Indeed, it is so bad that it would be the equivalent of someone today writing to his mother and he says, "Dear Mom, congratulate I, me just got a PhD in English Lit." We would consider that to be really atrocious grammar. That's what it looks like here in Revelation 1:4. But we've mentioned externally that we have the earlier manuscripts, so we've got date, we've got the better manuscripts that have from he, and we have the majority of later manuscripts that have from him. So we're looking at date and character. We're looking at geographical distribution. These manuscripts are distributed in other parts of the empire, and it's not just the Greek manuscripts, but other witnesses. And we're also looking at genealogical solidarity. Within each text form, the better witnesses seem to have from he. So externally, we'd say from he looks like it's original. But from internal evidence, now how do we deal with this? Are we going to say the author just doesn't know Greek at all? He could hardly rub 2 sentences together without making huge mistakes? When 32 other times in the book of Revelation, that same preposition is used and he has the right case after it instead of the nominative case or from the idea of from he. And so John, who wrote the book of Revelation, certainly knew what the case was to be used after that preposition. And we also look at the transcriptional evidence, where here are these scribes that they would have a natural tendency to want to replace he to him, so it would fit the grammar properly. Now, all of that suggests that the original wording would be from he. Both the external evidence and the internal evidence suggest from he is the original wording of Revelation 1:4. But as you look deeper into this, there's another level of things that are going on here when we think in terms of the author's style, of his narrative art, the context, these kinds of things. What we discover is this. In Revelation 1:3, he says, "Pay careful attention to the words of this prophecy, and those who pay careful attention to them and keep them will be blessed." And then you get into the very next verse, and he says, "From he." Well, these first readers would say, "Wait a minute, John, you told us to pay careful attention to your words. You should be doing the same thing." But you're not doing the same thing. Why should we pay careful attention to your words? Well, what he's got here is actually a strategy to help them understand his book. In our modern translations, we have a reference section that typically goes down the middle of 2 columns or on the side of its 1 column of references that this text is similar to and typically is referring back to. The book of Revelation quotes from the Old Testament hundreds of times, far more than any other text of the New Testament, far more than any other book of the New Testament, the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, quotes from the Old Testament. And yet, remarkably, not once is any one of those quotes begun with something like, "It stands written," "It is written," "God says," "Moses says," "Daniel says," anything like that. All of these quotations, or allusions, if you will, are indirect in the sense that they have no formal introduction to signal I'm quoting from the Old Testament text. And so as you look at this, what's remarkable also is you look into the text and you begin to discover that these quotations from the Old Testament are very frequently kept in the original form of what the Greek translation of the Old Testament would have had it in, known as the Septuagint. And when you look at Revelation 1:4, we're looking at a text which would have been perhaps the most well-known verse of the entire Old Testament to Gentile converts in the 1st century AD. They come to faith in Jesus Christ, and they say, "Who is this God that we worship?" That's the same question that Moses asked God on Mount Sinai at the burning bush. And God says, "I am who I am." Now in the Greek, in the Septuagint, it's ego eimi haon. And the haon here is also the haon that occurs after the preposition from in Revelation 1:4. But here's the point. That kind of language would be like saying, "Do you believe in we the people?" If I were to say that to you, what I'd be talking about is, do you believe in the Constitution? Because I'm quoting from the preamble of the Constitution. Now, technically, it's not grammatically correct. I should say, do you believe in us the people? But if I were to say, do you believe in us the people? Then what I would be having is a text that you would not be as familiar with. You lose the illusion if you change the grammatical form of it. In ancient Greek, there were no quotation marks. So for John to write this text in a way that his readers would know what he's quoting from, he has to keep it in the original grammatical form that's found in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, so that they can read the text and say, aha, he's talking about this verse, Exodus 3:14. And so again, as we look at this text closer, when you see apa haon, which we have in Revelation 1:4, or from he, I think what John is saying is, this is from the immutable one, the one whose character does not change. This is from the Almighty God. But he doesn't say that explicitly because he's trying to get his readers to dive into the Old Testament to find out what he's talking about. In recent years, a scholar on the Apocalypse by the name of Dr. Greg Beale has argued that John's texts where he uses what we would normally call bad grammar really line up in a remarkable number of places with those very same places where he's quoting from the Septuagint. And consequently, what Dr. Beale sees as happening is that John is getting his audience to read those Old Testament texts. It's like every time he uses bad grammar, it sends a flag up the pole that says, okay, now search and find out what I'm talking about. And you have to ask yourself, well, why doesn't he just say, this is from Daniel chapter 9, verse 13 or something? In part, the reason that John didn't quote Daniel 9:13 and say so is because there were no verse numbers back then. But another part of his strategy seems to be that he wants to communicate what he's saying to his readers without those who are in charge of getting this letter from the island of Patmos to Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey, would be understanding what's going on. If he said, for example, Domitian is a jerk, the emperor of Rome at the time, I don't think that letter could get out to those churches because he was the emperor and John was exiled on the island of Patmos. Consequently, he's got to get his message to them in a way that they will understand, but that the Romans will not understand. And this seems to be the strategy that he has done to accomplish this. The very next verse quotes from the Psalms, where we've got Psalm 89 quoted, and it says, the faithful witness, the true one. And the form of the Greek is exactly the same as we have in the Septuagint of Psalm 89, while as it should not be that form in Revelation 1:5. So John starts with the very famous verse, the well-known verse to these Gentile converts, Exodus 3:14. And then from there he moves into some other texts, Psalm 89, and all the way through the book of Revelation. He is quoting from parts of the Old Testament, keeping it in the original form, so his readers will know, aha, he's telling us to go and see what text he's talking about so we can interpret what this book is all about. To sum up external and internal evidence, combining these two features to determine what the original wording of a particular variant is, or a particular place in the text is. When you look at the external evidence and you think about the date and character, the geographical distribution, the genealogical solidarity, you come to a conclusion that says, on the basis of the material evidence that I've got, I think I can come up with a hypothesis that reading A is the ancestor of reading B. That is, reading B came from reading A. Then you look at the internal evidence and you say, on the basis of intrinsic evidence and the basis of transcriptional evidence, I can say that reading B seems to be the ancestor of reading A. Now, when you have a conflict like that, you have to work through the issues and say, well, external evidence suggests that reading A was the first reading. Internal suggests that reading B is the first one. You work through that conflict, always with a question in mind, choose the reading which best explains the rise of the others. But in the instance of Revelation 1:4, it's pretty easy for us to see how the data line up. Both the external and the internal evidence are on the same side. The external evidence suggests, because of the dates of these manuscripts and because of their character, because of their genealogical solidarity and their geographical distribution, that what Revelation 1:4 originally said is from He who is. Now, when we look at the internal evidence, it also lines up with the external and says the same thing. It is most likely that the author wrote from He who is in light of what his agenda seems to be of equating unusual grammar with direct quotation from the Septuagint. And you also look at the transcriptional probability. And what is the scribe likely to do? The scribe is likely to change this to more normal grammar, to good grammar, if you will, because he doesn't understand the nature of what the author is trying to accomplish. And so internal evidence and external evidence are used in combination to try to choose the reading which best explains the rise of the other, which, as far as the evidence is concerned, that tells us this is the wording of the autograph in that place.